Phil Anderson called, and John mentioned, more is different. In other words, there's more to the network than evident in the properties of its individual parts, the neurons and synapses. There can be, in principle, a collective form of dynamics in the neural activity that is the result of the interactions between these neurons. Those interactions being determined by the specific pattern of connections. This is the idea of an emergent property. Second, that 1992 paper and subsequent work in 1984 was, for me and I think for many, the very first clear elucidation of the idea that it was important and appropriate to think of the activity of the network of neurons as a point in a state space where each axis represents the activity of a neuron. The neural state space is what we call it now. The dynamics of the circuit, in other words, how the pattern evolved with time, could be thought of as a trajectory or flow in that state space. Importantly, John showed mathematically that in this associative memory model, the flow in this state space corresponded to going downhill on an energy landscape. And furthermore, he emphasized that the process of following that trajectory was in fact the computation of recalling a memory or pattern from partial information. So this idea of computation as the flow through state space of a dynamical system is really front and center in systems neuroscience now, 40 years later. In the last few years, it has been popularized as through the term computation through dynamics. It really started, at least for me and others who follow John's work, with that Hopfield 1982 paper. It is more general than just associative memory, and John showed that in the 1984 paper and subsequent work. For example, a decision circuit, like those considered in things like two alternative forced choice models, could be implemented as an attractor network. In this case, the computation was a decision, and the flow to the fixed point is the choice made. The popular idea of a winner-take-all circuit, which we all know about, is also at its basis a recurrent attractor neural network in the style inspired by the Hopfield model. Over the subsequent years, I was lucky enough to work with John to explore more elaborate forms of recurrent networks where the structure of the computational problem was mapped onto a network's energy landscape, and the flow through state space produced the answer to the computation. It gradually became very clear, I think both to us, it was always clear to John, and the neural community at large, that the pattern of connections was the essence of the computation. It was the way the system was programmed. This kind of thinking, both in recurrent networks and in feed-forward networks like the multi-layer perceptron, basically led to the foundation of what we now call connectionism. Our colleague Sebastian Sung has summarized that beautifully, I think, in his book on connectomics. So the notion of collective computation, more is different, in a network of connected neurons, computation through dynamics, and connectionism are very core conceptual ideas in systems neuroscience today that were strongly influenced by the work cited in this prize. Well, were there other implications in the field of neuroscience? Well, the whole conceptual framework he developed implicitly emphasized the importance of recording many neurons at once. After all, the information was in the pattern of activity. You need to sample enough of the activity to understand the population state of the system and follow its evolution in time in order to understand the computation. I can only say that this kind of thinking was not terribly popular in that era 40 years ago when John's paper was published. Even 20 years ago, an eminent prize-winning cortical electrophysiologist said to me, "David, why would we want to record for more than one neuron at a time when we can't even make sense of our single neuron recordings?" No one would say that now. Even that neuroscientist doesn't say that. And thus, in a generation, an entire field changed its way of thinking. In my own career and the group at Bell, starting in the 80s and continuing to this day, it put emphasis on recording the brain in action. At Bell Labs, in what became known as the Biological Computation Research Department, this heralded fMRI, calcium imaging of neural activity, two-photon excitation microscopy in vivo, and even multi-electrode recording tools. Now these neurotechnologies are commonplace in neuroscience labs worldwide, And much of what we do today on a day-to-day basis is an attempt to relate population-level coding and dynamics to computation. I could go on and on about the influence John has had in other areas of neuroscience like olfaction and synchrony. Carlos may discuss this, but I'll just mention one that is important to us at Princeton: continuous attractor networks. The Hopfield model is considered a point attractor, the flow in the neural state space to memory toward a fixed point of the dynamics. Networks with a continuous set of fixed points followed from the work of Chaim Sampolinsky and Sebastian Sun. I should say that John's leadership and impact of the field catalyzed a sizable number of theoretical physicists to move into the field, including Sampolinsky and Sebastian. Sebastian in particular applied it to the model of a circuit in the ocular motor system where the fixed points correspond to gaze fixations. John sponsored that paper for submission. We now know that these continuous attractors are real circuits in the brain. It is, for example, the basis of the ring attractor central complex circuit for heading direction in the fruit fly, a circuit beautifully reconstructed in the recent Flywire connectome from Mala and Sebastian. Similarly, there's a compelling evidence from another theorist, D. Lafitte, influenced by John, that grid cells in the entorhinal cortex are a continuous attractor network. So in addition to these incredible and conceptual advances, John has been passionate about changing education. In 2002, he participated in the Committee on Undergraduate Biology Education to prepare research scientists for the 21st century. This was sponsored by the National Academy of Science. It was sort of entitled Bio 2010, and it provided a roadmap for modernizing undergraduate biology education. This report and the thinking behind it led to a number of programs in Princeton. First and foremost, it helped David Botstein and Ned Wingreen, among others, garner the resources for what became the integrated science undergraduate curriculum. Second, it catalyzed a group of us to begin a quantitative and computational biology training program at Princeton for graduate students and postdoc. This in turn provided a foundation for the effort John Cohen and I put into the development of the QCN, the Quantitative and Computational Neuroscience Program. And in general, the emphasis and founding of P&I on a philosophy of doing science heavily weighted to modeling theory and moving more and more from descriptive to quantitative theory-driven experiments using the latest tools in what we now call neurotechnology. So in a very real way, John, you were instrumental in making P&I what it is today. Finally, let me say that John has an office in P&I. You should visit him when he is here. You will learn something new, I promise. John is remarkable in his ability to keep going for years and years. You may not or may not know this, but he has published a number of papers over the last decades. The most recent ones, co-authored with Dmitry Krotov, now at IBM MIT AI Lab, extend that 1982 model in new directions, enormously increasing its memory capacity. As expected from John, this comes with a mathematical understanding so utterly absent in our understanding of other systems in use in neural network-based AI. So in closing, thank you, John, for being such a fabulous mentor and colleague in the early days of my career. You completely changed my trajectory, and more importantly, changed the entire field of neural networks and computational and theoretical neuroscience and biology more broadly. Congratulations on a Nobel Prize, much deserved.